كلمات الله وسوريا وبشار. كنيسة وجامع متحدين ولمحط بعنوان الدين، وملايين السوريين وما بدهن إلا بشار. هز الكون وما بينهزوا، يا ربي من عندك عز الجيش السوري هالمغوار. رجالك يا بشار، سوريا رجالها فرسان، لما بتنزل عالميدان الا بتحرير الجولان، وما بيرضى القائد بشار. رجالك يا بشار. ابراهيم هانانو والسلطان باشا بزمانه، شعل فرنسا بالنار. والشيخ صالح بجباله قاد الثورة برجاله، وحافظ وصى أشباله بسوريا بلد الأحرار. الحرية بحروف الأبجدية، سريان وفينيقية، غير سوريا ما منختار. رجالك يا بشار، قولوا بالصوت العالي بدنا نصون الرسالة للغالي وابن الغالي، وبالروح منفدي بشار. رجالك يا بشار. الشعب السوري بالساحات وللمجد بيرفع راياته، عم يهتف بثلاث كلماته الله سوريا وبشار. رجالك يا بشار. الله وسوريا وبشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. الله وسوريا وبشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. كنيسة وجامع متحدين ولمحط بعنوان الدين، وملايين السوريين وما بدهن إلا بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. سوريا. الشعب السوري بالساحات للمجد بيرفع رايات، عم يهتف بثلاث كلمات الله وسوريا وبشار. رجالك يا بشار. كنيسة وجامع متحدين ولمحط بعنوان الدين، وملايين السوريين وما بدهن إلا بشار. رجالك يا بشار. سوريا. هز الكون وما بينهزوا، يا ربي من عندك عز الجيش السوري هالمغوار. رجالك يا بشار. سوريا رجال 10,000 فرسان لما بتنزل عالميدان إلا بتحرير الجولان وما بيرضى القائد بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. سوريا الله حامية. سوريا الله حامية. إبراهيم هانانو والسلطان باشا بزمانو شعل فرنسا بالنار. والشيخ صالح بجباله قاد الثورة برجاله وحافظ وصى أشباله بسوريا بلد الأحرار. الحرية بحروف الأبجدية سريان وفينيقية غير سوريا ما منختار. رجالك يا بشار. قولوا بالصوت العالي بدنا نصون الرسالة للغالي وابن الغالي وبالروح منفدي بشار. رجالك يا بشار. الشعب السوري بالساحات وللمجد بيرفع راياته عم يهتف بثلاث كلماته الله سوريا وبشار. رجالك يا بشار. الله وسوريا وبشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. الله وسوريا وبشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. كنيسة وجامع متحدين والمحبة عنوان الدين وملايين السوريين وما بدهن إلا بشار. نحن رجالك يا بشار. سوريا. الشعب السوري بالساحات للمجد بيرفع رايات عم يهتف بثلاث كلمات الله وسوريا وبشار. رجالك يا بشار. كنيسة وجامع متحدين والمحبة عنوان الدين وملايين السوريين وما بدهن إلا بشار.
Even while I've left this song playing, the iconic song, which will probably be the last we'll ever hear of this song, the news just keeps coming in. Like, it is just even while it just doesn't stop. It really doesn't. Whenever I first planned this stream last night and through the day I've been keeping tabs, I had sort of a structure laid out what I was going to do in this stream and what I was going to say and like where my interest in this came from, following it through the 2010s, leading up to like what exactly happened like 72 hours ago and why it happened. But I'm just completely like, I'm scrolling through X right now and I'm scrolling through Telegram and there's just new news. There's just a new update. It is moving so fast. I don't even know where to start. It's just apparently there's now been a rising of rebels in the south again, in around Dara. And then there's groups of a new rebellion started on the road between Homs and Hama, trying to block off the Syrian army that is seemingly just incapable of stopping and is in pure retreat. There's reports of Coup in Damascus. It appears that, going by some reports, that President al-Assad's brother, who's the leader of the 4th Division and elite division of the Syrian army, Mahar al-Assad, has begun a coup, which it appears that Bashar al-Assad just flew back from Moscow within the last 2 hours, so either it was timed up for him to arrive, but then there's other reports saying that Bashar al-Assad is still in Moscow, and that the coup, quote-unquote, in Damascus is actually the 4th Division found a, quote-unquote, sleeper rebel cell and destroyed that. There's reports that elements of the Syrian army have begun defecting and mutinying on another across the country. There's reports that apparently Russian soldiers in Hama were given explicit instructions to shoot at Syrian soldiers who tried to retreat, but by the time that order came through, the Syrian troops had already retreated. There's reports that there was an ultimatum jointly agreed by the Iranians and the Russians that laid a very explicit ultimatum to the Syrians that either you stand and fight in Hama or we are checking out of this thing, which what is happening in Hama at the moment. There's reports that rebels have entered the city and just driven straight through it on their way to Homs. But then there's also other reports that there are actually still Syrian troops in the city, which I can believe because, in fact, I'll get into it. But look. If they make it, so look, right. I hope you enjoyed that video, the song, because that's probably going to be the last we ever hear of that song again. Because there have been dark times in the past for those of us who have long been invested in the Syrian situation. But this looks like it's the darkest. I'm not saying exactly how, if even half of this stuff is true, how it gets turned around. I hope it does, because I think the Syrian people have suffered enough. But it is bleak. It is very bleak at the moment. So I guess what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of plow straight into it. What's happened recently. So as always, we're going to go to one of tried and true methods of me whenever I do these shit streams, a beloved map stream. So we're going to have a look at a map. So, right, is that the map? Yes, right. So we're going to have a look at a map, just get an idea of what has happened in basically the last 72 to 94 hours. 96 hours, how bad it is. It's just, I'm like, even now in the last 5 minutes, the stories that are flying through. It's just, it doesn't stop. It's just constant reports. If you want to sum it up, for me to sum it up, state collapse. This is like Afghanistan in the Middle East. The army is refusing to fight. Not that it's just complete chaos. The army has refused effectively to fight, as in effectively a never-ending rout. And subsequently, the state, Bashar al-Assad's state, is extremely brittle, and it is now in the process of collapsing. And it appears to be collapsing literally as we speak. So, I don't even know where to begin, because, like, there you go, even more news coming through about what's... I don't even know where to begin, because it's so rapid. So, like, we're gonna go back about 92 hours to where this all started in the recent past, before we try to bring it up to here and now. So Essentially, what was it about at the start of the week? There were rumors. I actually think I might have posted them in the Telegram. Let's just have a quick look and see before I actually inadvertently see when was the most major rebel. Okay, well that's where I first started posting it, but could have sworn I had posted some stuff before that. But essentially, from what I can recall, is that there was mutterings on various Telegram channels that the Syrian army was about to begin a new fairly sizable offensive into Idlib, which is this dark green territory on this map. Idlib is a region of Syria that, for essentially since the beginning of the war, and I'm not going to go through the entire history because we'll be here for hours going over it, but for all intents and purposes, Idlib is kind of like the heart of the Islamist, the like pro Al Qaeda, the terrorist element of the Syrian factions. Well, quote unquote Syrian. Early on in the civil war, explicitly Islamist groups took over most of Idlib province. And generally, through the course of the war, they expanded their control and solidified and set up effectively an Islamic State in Idlib. And since Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian army effectively kind of became predominant during the conflict, especially after the Russian intervention, but certainly around about 2017 up until 2020, the Syrian army was effectively constantly on the offensive, slowly regaining back ground here and there, liberated Hama, Homs, Aleppo, and was slowly chipping away at this territory in Idlib, which is held by explicitly like Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist, pro-Al Qaeda groups, effectively ISIS-light kind of people. These are the people who are notorious for consuming the human hearts of Syrian soldiers have captured, beheading children, trying to genocide Christians, Alawites, Druze, anyone who isn't a Sunni Shia. This is the group that kind of attracted, and pretty much what is reflected, and I'll go into this probably a bit later in the stream, this group tends to be predominantly non-Syrian. These are made up of pretty much every nationality apart from Syrians themselves. You have Chechens running around in this group. You have Uzbeks. You have Uyghurs, Islamist Uyghurs from China. You have Western converts, Western Muslims who've come over to fight jihad. You have various Arabs from across the region who have coalesced into this abomination in Idlib that has sat there, slowly being chipped away by the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians over the years. 2020 comes along. And see, the problem is geopolitics of this. You could get into it for hours, but this is where we have to bring in perhaps the biggest villain of this entire thing, which is this fucking country to the north, which is pretty much the bane of any civilized world order at the moment. Turkey, especially under the lead Turk roach, Erdogan. Of course, Turks, loving genocide as they do, have an eternal problem with Kurds. And because of, through the course of the conflict in Syria, the Kurdish groups secured a significant amount of northern and northeastern Syria. And this has put them at eternal odds of the Turks, who are constantly saying that the Kurds are attacking Syria and all this kind of stuff, and constantly alleging that the Kurds in Syria are the one and the same as the PKK, which are the communist, quote-unquote, terrorist organization, Kurdish terrorist organization inside Turkey itself that has waged a decades-long insurgency against the Turkish state. So, over the years, you had the Turks slowly increase their operations inside Syria. If people remember the infamous battle, God, what is the name of the town? Trying to remember the big famous battle at the Kobani. Yes, Kobani, that was the one. The Kurds held a bunch of strongholds up here whenever ISIS was like really into their stride, whenever ISIS was on the march across the region. the Kurds held various strongholds and withheld sieges against ISIS, Kobani being the big one. But the Turks didn't like that very much, and eventually the Turks then launched a military operation into Syria, which carved out this area, which is explicitly under like Turkish occupation. The Turkish army pretty much controls this dark blue area, in a way just trying to deny the Kurds territory. The Kurds used to hold this area up here called Afrin. This was an area where during the early stages of the civil war, the Kurds established control over the territory there. Eventually, the Turks didn't like that, so then they set up... The Kurds have their hands in pretty much everything bad that happens in Syria, and always have. The reason why the war has prolonged so far is because of the Kurds. Is because of the Turks, I mean. Sorry, the Turks are effectively at the heart of pretty much every problem that occurs in Syria. So, the Turks they will deny it, because of course, you know, Western ally Turkey can't be seen to be funding and directly supporting and arming effectively Al-Qaeda and ISIS-like groups in Syria. But effectively, Idlib, the groups in Idlib, the various plethora of Islamist groups are Turkish proxies. That's one wing of the Turkish influence inside Syria. The other wing is the quote-unquote secular democratic faction in Syria, the quote-unquote Syrian National Army. This is the thing that like the shitlibs got behind. This is meant to be like the continuation of the Free Syrian Army. The apparently liberal democratic, they want to create a fuzzy, cuddly, warm, Western-style democracy in Syria kind of thing whenever they're not beheading people, blowing up car bombs in Christian villages, trying to exterminate the local Druze, Kurdish populations, you know, those kind of Western-backed people. So the Turks pretty much set up this other group called the Syrian National Army, which, while nominally it was meant to mostly be against the quote-unquote Syrian regime and against quote-unquote ISIS and other Islamist groups, in effect it was mostly set against the Kurds. So the Syrian National Army, it was like the open Turkish proxy on the ground in the region, which is this light blue territory here in the north of Syria. So whenever the Turks began their operation in to clear out Afrin, if people remember this is going back years, but the image, like if you Google Turkish Leopard tanks, you'll come up with images of destroyed Leopard 2 tanks in Turkish service in Syria. That was during this operation here. The Kurds gave out a good resistance against them, but ultimately it was a losing battle. But the Syrian National Army was kind of like the boots on the ground that did most of the fighting. The Turks provided artillery, the heavy equipment and stuff to push out the Kurds, and established this quasi-statelet up here in the north of the country. So you have the Turks supporting two effective rebel factions in Syria itself. So going back to Idlib, we're talking about 2019, 2020. This is a time frame we're talking about now. The Syrian army and the Russians were effectively on the ascendancy. It looked like only a matter of time until Bashar al-Assad had de facto pretty much won the war. It looked like only a matter of time. Slowly but surely, the Syrian army would chip away at Idlib and eventually reestablish control over pretty much the entire country, because there had been an agreement between the Kurdish factions and the Damascus government to establish kind of like a quasi-federation, some kind of agreement between the Kurds and the government in Damascus. The Turks couldn't abide that, so then the Turks went into Idlib and established these like small garrison listening posts and stuff. Conveniently, they all tended to stretch along the front line on the Islamist side. So in effect, the Turks went in and cock-blocked the Syrian army and the Russians from being able to properly go into Idlib and clear out what remained of the various jihadist factions there. Then we come to Vladimir Putin and his amazing geopolitical strategy. Because for some reason Vladimir Putin seems to think that freezing conflicts everywhere and anywhere is God's gift to Earth and the height of geopolitical strategy. he, against the wishes and the advice of Bashar al-Assad and the Iranians, signed pretty much like a ceasefire de facto kind of agreement with the Turks, which is one thing you would imagine history would prove you never do, is sign deals with Turks and expect the Turks to adhere to them. So 2020, Moscow pretty much forces this agreement on Damascus and says, right, look, the war is frozen. There'll be small artillery skirmishes. There might be small battles along here, taking a village here and there. But pretty much the high intensity period of the war is over. And that's kind of where we've sat from 2020 up until about 96 hours ago. The problem is that during that time, is that the war, the high intensity phase of the war might have been over, but Syria hasn't really recovered. The Damascus government hasn't really properly recovered. There's a number of things that have occurred during that time, which has kind of led to where we are. This is the domestic element. There's a lot of geopolitics that have helped shape the situation that we are currently in. So while you had this lowering of the high intensity period of the war, a lot of the hardcore veterans of the Syrian army, the people who have been fighting since 2011, 2013, the people who have been fighting for years, your elite units, your proper quality regular elements of the Syrian army, a lot of them were retired off. They were mustered out. Understandably, it's like, you've been fighting for 8 years, guys. Now's probably the time that you know, fair enough, the war's kind of mostly over. You guys can go off and enjoy a bit of peace, kind of thing. Not that didn't happen to all of them, but a large majority of the bulk of the force that seems to have fought during the high intensity period of the conflict were mustered out, because the way the Syrian army kind of recruits is it's a pretty brutal conscription force. Pretty much everyone over the age of 18 is required to provide military service, and it's kind of open-ended how long that military service would last. This is very unpopular, understandably, for a lot of young Syrians who don't particularly want to be with low motivation, pretty much little to no pay, be conscripted into a force that really, during this period, wasn't so much as an army, as more of like a militarized paramilitary police force kind of thing, or even as like conscripted labor. So you're talking about young Syrian men who would grow up, if they stayed in the country and couldn't get out, or couldn't get an exemption, they'd be conscripted into the army, told maybe 2-3 years or even longer, you need to do your service. With very little training, they might be given a rifle, told you're being assigned to this unit, and then shipped off to somewhere in Deir el-Zor, or in Homs, or in Aleppo province, or down in Dara, and they'll go down there, and then they'll be told, okay, you're effectively a garrison troop, you're to go out and just keep the locals in line, or they're shipped off to Hama or Homs, given a spade and told, right, yeah, it's military service, but your military service requires you to effectively clean up the rubble from the fighting that happened here. And also, if you get paid at all, the pay is going to be very low. And of course, because of sanctions and the general situation in the economy, what they did get paid didn't exactly go far. So the quality of living for these conscript soldiers in the Syrian army weren't the best. So there was a lot of desertion, a lot of people avoiding conscription. And that's kind of hollowed out the Syrian army. That some people might see some parallels to the sort of pre-war Russian army as it went into Ukraine. This sort of like corruption element. A lot of Syrian officers would sign on various people who might have deserted or never even existed in the first place into their unit to claim the very little pay that would come into their unit. So in effect, what you would have would be like these ghost divisions where it might even be like 20% manpower are actually in the unit, but the officers in charge of the unit might be reporting back to Damascus or wherever in command that they're at like 60-70% strength. So that's kind of one element of this disaster. the other element of this disaster in terms of the army is the still remaining very well equipped and motivated units. These are sort of like the remnants of like your Tiger forces, your elite Republican Guard units, these kind of men. The 25th Special Force, is it? Yeah, the 25th, I think it's just the 25th Division. These guys who were well motivated, they understood the stakes of what were at stake. These are the men who held out in the darkest days. These are the people who fought tooth and nail to reclaim these various cities. They're all still around, but like I say, many of their compatriots have been mustered out because you know, 13 years into a war with an economy that basically doesn't exist. It's very expensive to keep men under arms, especially good quality men, to keep them equipped and stuff. A lot of these people would come under Russian patronage. They would be armed and trained by the Russians. A lot of them were mustered out into retirement. Quite a few of them seem to have kind of jumped on the Wagner ship. They haven't turned up in Ukraine, but they kind of signed contracts with Wagner, and a lot of these good quality veterans, Syrian veterans, are actually kind of off in Sudan, the Sahel, Central Africa, doing operations with Wagner. They're like auxiliaries for Wagner and various Russian private military corporations, operations and stuff like that. So you still have this core of very good quality Syrian troops, but a lot of the work that they are doing is actually in the center of the country. So just to give you an idea, so bear in mind, pretty much up until about 5 days ago, this was kind of like a quiet front. There wasn't expected to be much going on here. So all the veterans are kind of in central Syria, where there is still the remnants of ISIS are conducting an insurgency. Very low level, but nonetheless, they're still there. So you have this ongoing fighting and operations by these quality Syrian troops, mostly directed against these people. Or you have them down here kind of bulking up the conscripts. So you'll have like the conscripts and your sort of bog standard Syrian soldiers who will be kind of doing like I was saying, paramilitary police work. They'll be guarding like a road or an outpost, or just keeping an eye on the locals in some previously pro-rebel town down in Dara province. Well, whenever it comes to like the actual going after potential rebels and doing the raids and stuff to secure the actual control of Dara, that would be given to like these sort of regular veteran troops, these kind of people. So whenever things really start to kick off, well, the veterans largely aren't where they need to be, and the troops that are there are, if they are capable of fighting, are not very. They're not, well, if they are in the position to fight, they're not exactly the most reliable or capable to put up a fight. So that's kind of one aspect of the domestic issue. Another aspect which I've kind of again, I'm not an expert on this stuff. This is just what I've perceived, me putting the dots together. I was a big Syrian war autist back in the 2010s, which is why I'm kind of invested in this. I'm sure quite a few of you guys probably spent many hours during the 2010s watching the Abkhazian News Network as they filmed the latest operations by the Syrian troops to secure another neighborhood in Damascus, or on various threads in Pole, or just generally following the war, and probably more often than not with a pro-Bashar al-Assad Syrian government bent. So another aspect I've kind of deduced is that the Syrian army, especially under Russian tutelage, seems to have retained, and especially since 2020, strengthened the old Soviet model where orders come down from the top through a very strict hierarchy with very little autonomy given out to local troops. So essentially, if anyone is to do anything, especially combat-wise, well, they need to wait on orders from division. They need to wait on orders from battalion. Battalion need to wait for their orders from division. Division need, well, I guess it would be from regiment, battalion, regiment, division. Division needs to wait on their orders coming down from the general commanding officer, and then the general commanding officer is probably waiting for the ultimate word to come down from Damascus. So it's a very top-down approach with very little autonomy and initiative granted to local commanders and units as to their course of action. So if there's a communication blackout and local units and local commanders cannot get in touch with regimental command and then divisional command and then the commanding officer in general, or if Damascus is quiet, these local units are completely in the dark. They don't know what they're going to do. The only way they're getting news is by looking at social media, be it WhatsApp, be it Telegram, maybe even X, to try and assess what has happened. They're hearing reports that, the rebels are actually not in front of us on the front line. They're actually 5 miles behind us on our supply road. How has that happened? What do we do here? Well, let's retreat, kind of thing. So it creates an element of paralysis. So you have these number of domestic issues, kind of the 3 big domestic issues, I would say, that's kind of created this disaster, because this is a catastrophe of many mothers. Many very unique elements have come together at the worst possible time to be exploited by the Turkish proxies in Syria. So that's the domestic issues. In terms of geopolitically, what has happened to align this? Well, I'm sure most of you guys don't need to know, but Syria's biggest benefactor, who pretty much kind of helped, if not did win them the war from 2015 onwards, Russia, is kind of a bit preoccupied at the moment. I'm sure none of you guys need to be told what exactly is preoccupying Moscow at the moment. But needless to say, the manpower and especially the equipment and munitions that would normally be available that you could rush into Syria at this moment, I think Moscow has a far more closer to home and important task for those men and equipment. So a big example would be like the VDV, or the Russian Naval Infantry. The Russian Naval Infantry especially was quite active in Syria in 2015. These were the guys who kind of pretty much led the Russian pushback in 2015 to help stabilize things in Syria. And then also, whenever you have like a very fast developing situation like this, you would use the VDV, air mobile troops who could very quickly be put on a bunch of aircraft with their light vehicles, the BMPs and stuff, and rapidly flown within reason to conflict areas around the world where they can be rapidly deployed, good quality troops that you can put to do what you need them to do. Well, again, without going into big details about what exactly has gone on, needless to say, the Russian Naval Infantry and the Russian VDV are not exactly in a position or much freedom at the moment to be rapidly redeployed to a conflict in the Middle East. Most of them kind of died in the streets of Irpin or in the Donbass, and those who remain are kind of heavily engaged in Kursk, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass. So I don't think we're going to be seeing much of a Russian expeditionary force being shipped out to Syria anytime soon to help stabilize the situation. So that's one element of the geopolitical alignment of the stars against the Damascus government. The other big geopolitical events that have gone on is Syria's biggest other backer, Iran. Again, I hope I don't have to say too much about this, but Iran has certainly been busy for the past year and has taken some blows, especially in terms of the forces that it would use in this kind of situation. Obviously, there's pretty much a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel at the moment. While there hasn't been so much of direct blows between each other of any like major note that would cripple the military or expeditionary capabilities of Iran, the kind of troops that Iran would nominally usually deploy in this situation would be groups like Hezbollah. Again, I'm sure I don't need to say much to you guys to kind of say why Hezbollah are not able to commit to the fight as much as they normally would, because obviously Hezbollah kind of seriously cut its teeth. Many of its troops got a lot of combat experience from fighting in Syria during the first sort of stage of the war, 2011 up until 2020. Well, they've kind of been busy for the past year, and especially the past, 4 months. Hezbollah has taken some pretty bad blows, kind of hollowed out as an effective force. So I don't think Hezbollah, which would normally be Iran's big kind of card to play in this scenario, is going to be much of a... There's not going to be much of an expeditionary force there to deploy to stabilize things in Syria. So that's the other big geopolitical thing that is kind of aligned against Iran at the moment. Also, the only other thing that really, which seems to be kind of being put into the play, is in Iraq you have various pro-Iranian groups called the Popular Mobilization Units. So whenever ISIS became a big thing and overran Mosul in 2015, and it's kind of very similar, as it were, to what's happened that we've seen happen in Syria. The Iraqi government, the Iraqi army pretty much completely collapsed whenever ISIS crossed the border and stormed Mosul in 2015. And it was ultimately the militias, especially the Kurds and the Popular Mobilization Units, these sort of generally, not always, but generally pro-Iranian Shia groups in Iraq, rose up and kind of stabilized the situation and helped push back ISIS. Whenever they did that, a lot of many of these Popular Mobilization Units went on into Syria to fight for the Syrian government, particularly against ISIS. Some of them went on to fight against the Islamists up in Idlib kind of territory. There's been various mutterings here that some of these Iraqi groups are mobilizing once again to go back into Syria. We will have to wait and see if they do that, if there is even the time for them to attempt to do that. The other aspect is maybe the Iranians, and it appears that the Syrian government, there's been some reports put out that the Syrian government has made actually formally requested a military intervention from Tehran to stabilize the situation in Syria. Very doubtful if that would happen, because, well, if it would benefit things, because if the Iranians go into Syria, there would be a very big question of what would the Iranians be doing there. Like if they send in the Republican Guard, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, are they? Because this has kind of been a problem with with the Iranians in Syria. Yes, they've done a lot of work to fight against the various rebel factions in Syria, but ultimately the Iranian view towards Syria has largely always been as a platform to attack Israel. So if the Iranians send the Guards Corps back into Syria, what are they going to be there to fight this war for Bashar al-Assad and try and save the situation in Syria, or are they going to be there to provoke a new war with Israel? Because the Israelis especially have not been shy about continuously bombing, particularly Iranian assets within Syria with near impunity. That is one aspect that has also weakened the regime over the various years, is these constant Israeli airstrikes that have weakened the Iranians in country and also undermined them. So if the Iranians decide to do a very large deployment of Revolutionary Guards into Syria, are they going to be there to fight the rebels, or are they there to provoke a war with Israel? Are the Israelis just going to begin bombing the Revolutionary Guards whenever they start massing up there in force? Could the Iranians maybe decide, okay, the Revolutionary Guards had their chance, and they've kind of blown it. Maybe we'll start sending the actual Iranian army units, which is distinct from the Revolutionary Guards Corps. So could the Iranians send actual standing Iranian army troops to Syria Is that a feasible option? Is that something that Syrians would want? How would they do that? Would Iraq allow them to transit across its territory, be it by land, by air? How would the Israelis react to that? How would the Turks react to that? The Americans, of course, especially considering Biden seems to be particularly war hawkish in his final days in office. What would be their response to that? Obviously, Donald Trump's views on Iran are very strongly well known, and he has a history of being anti-Assad. What would be the long-term ramifications of that? Would there even be a long-term ramifications of that? Because it seems that every hour brings a new situation where it appears that Syria is effectively in complete and irreversible collapse. So you have these various geopolitical alignments that have also come together to create this very specific, unique set of events that have resulted in what has occurred in the last 96 hours. So now we'll move into what actually has occurred. So as I've kind of, again, I am meandering because I've kind of had to throw away my entire tentative script of what I was planning to say out to base this stream on, because things are just completely out of control. So as I say, I'm pretty sure I can recollect there was reports that the Syrian army was about to begin a new offensive into Idlib. There's over the past few months there have been increases in the Syrian army shelling rebel positions in Idlib and like. It doesn't appear that there ever was like a serious offensive on the cards, but nonetheless, that's what the claim was, is that the Syrian army was about to begin a new offensive into Idlib, and subsequently, that in as a quote-unquote spoiler offensive, the Turkish-aligned Islamist groups in Idlib began their own offensive, particularly towards Aleppo. Now, there's a lot of very conflicting things about what's happened and how it happened, but from my understanding, this is what occurred. So thankfully, this map has outlines of the old front line. So this dark green line is where the old front line was before this offensive occurred. So there were reports that the rebels began a push along this sort of northern part of the front. Very rapidly, it appeared that there was some scattered resistance by various Syrian army units, but that they were quickly overrun. And it appears that many of these units up in this part of the front were these kind of units that I was articulating earlier, these mostly conscript units, that the people in them are not very well motivated. They're young kids who have just been dragged out of their homes and given a rifle and told, right, you're in the army now. You're going up to Aleppo to defend the country, kind of thing. Not very well maintained, not very well trained, poorly equipped, poorly motivated troops. The kind of thing that I guess the commanders assumed could probably hold the line, but obviously not particularly quality troops. Then this was also undercut by the fact that the corrupt officers in many of these units would have been reporting in manpower strengths far larger than what was actually in the units, probably to steal the pay of the troops there. So these units very rapidly, after a few hours of intense combat, effectively disintegrated. So the rebels began to break through in serious numbers towards Aleppo in the first 24 hours. There appears that there was some kind of Russian unit as well in this area. There is reports that a Russian national, probably a private contractor of some kind, was captured in this area. So there was also a Russian unit of some description operating up in this sector. But effectively, once this collapse began, it just precipitated a general complete collapse of this entire front. Units behind the line, equally under strength, it appeared, began to disintegrate and fall back into Aleppo city itself. To the south, there was a bit more better news around the town of Sarkib. There was good quality units down here. The 25th Division, the Tiger Force, were operating in this area. They came under heavy and significant attack by HTS, which is the acronym of the main rebel group operating Islamist group. They held their own, it seemed. Not only did they hold their own against significant pressure from the rebel offensive, they actually went onto the counter-offensive, going by numerous reports, and pushed back the rebels at points. But generally, because of the situation to the north was so dire, they were ultimately compelled to retreat. So pretty much the way to look at it is, on the northern part of the front, just complete collapse. Whenever first contact was made, poorly equipped, poorly motivated, poorly led Syrian army units just effectively disintegrated. To the south, bit more of resistance, bit more probably some of the best quality units. Like I say, these are the Tiger Force men, held their own, but ultimately the general situation was just so dire that if they held and stood their ground in the town of Sarkib, they would have been ultimately surrounded and destroyed in kind. Now, the other aspect that appears to have occurred, which especially undermined any attempt to salvage this situation, was that there's very numerous reports. Pardon me. I will see if I can find them in the Telegram. Just to it appears that lessons have been learned. Let's have a look. It appears that lessons have been learned from the Israelis, in that there was a distinct attack on Syrian army communications, and in a eerily similar fashion, so it is reported that numerous elements of wireless communications, phones, walkie-talkies, stuff like that, began exploding, that the Syrian soldiers and officers were using. So, we've seen this recently, so quite how about that came into fashion is anyone's guess, but that's an allegation made. Another allegation that I've seen is that there was a massive, almost it could only have come from the Turks. The Turks began massive cyber and electronic warfare in Aleppo, particularly directed at Syrian military communications. So comms were down. People like this, again, I'm trying to feed back these various factors that have fed into this catastrophe. So going back to what I said, if you are running a military that is pretty much devoted to orders from the top, if you cannot get in touch with your commanding officers, and if that commanding officer can't hear from his battalion commander, if the battalion commander can't hear from the regimental command, if regiment can't hear from division, if division can't hear from the theater commander, and the theater commander can't hear from Damascus, it's paralysis. No one knows what they're doing. This is what appears to have happened during the first 72 hours of the offensive, particularly in Aleppo. What units were in the area were completely in the dark. This is why we're seeing footage of bewildered Syrian soldiers being captured in Aleppo over the past couple of days, going about their daily business, going into a shop, coming out of the shop and finding rebels in front of the shop and arresting them, and in some cases, pretty gruesome footage of it being executed. So, like, there's footage of a drunk Syrian officer who was coming out of a bar, unaware of what was going on, had no idea there was an offensive 2 days into the offensive, and being captured by the Islamist rebels. So you have this complete blackout of communications and command and control. And I think this is the big thing that is really done in the Syrian military, because if no one for 3 days into this can understand what is going on, what is happening, where people need to be, what needs to be done, where, with who, and how, the entire military is just paralyzed and completely in disarray. And so like, there is reports that at some points the only way that orders could be relayed to various units was for soldiers to physically take a car or a motorbike between units and relay orders by word of mouth. That's kind of how bad the situation got. So while you had this offensive, the rebels began the offensive in the north of Aleppo. You have these units at the front who have no idea what's going on. They've come under attack and they can't raise the communications are down. They can't call in artillery. They can't warn units behind the lines. They can't call for air power. Everything is done very much ad hoc, if it's done at all. As these various units are completely in the dark, their commanders, if they're good commanders at all, most often they're shit and they're corrupt. They opt to flee because they're not well supported. They don't know what's happening. They don't know what they're doing. So the best option for them and their men, if they're even thinking about their men, is they just get in their car and they drive out of the area. Initially to Aleppo, because they probably would be a logical assumption, would be, okay, maybe Aleppo, things are in control there. They drive to Aleppo to find it's chaos there. No one knows what's going on. People in the city don't even know there is an offensive going on. No one can hear from any of the general officers. Communications are still down. Next thing you know, you're having to resort to like social media. You're looking at WhatsApp, Telegram. You're looking at X, Twitter, to find out what's going on. Because up until the past couple hours, it appears that state media in Syria has pretty much completely refused to address what is going on. So you try and look at the radio or the TV. It's just like your normal soap dramas. It's your usual television. People are bewildered. There's rumors going around that something's happening at the front. You've just come from the front because you fled from it. You can't get in touch with any proper officers. You go potentially to the local police headquarters or even the local governor's building. If they're still there, they probably don't have an idea of what's going on. You look at social media and you're seeing reports that rebels are now are on the outskirts of Aleppo and they're coming into the city. So what you do is you flee again. You get in your car, or your vehicle, and you just hightail it out there. And then this has just kind of been a repeating series of events that have pretty much lost all of Aleppo and Idlib province to the Syrian army. Eventually, some measure of communication was restored, and there were attempts, various reports that the Syrian army was trying to erect new defensive lines at various positions here, there, and everywhere. But by this time, the rebels had clearly clocked on that the regime, the army, was very brittle, and they've adopted so it's kind of very frustrating because from my understanding and from looking at the footage is particularly what is occurring down here towards Hama. This push, from what I can, there's probably more troops going down at every time, but like the vanguard of this rebel push is like 40 pickup trucks with people with light armaments in them driving down the main roads towards Hama, stopping off in various villages along the way to take selfies, upload them to social media, and then they get back in their trucks and they drive on. They aren't really establishing proper control over the town. They aren't clearing the towns. They aren't really, it's a light force that's effectively on a raid. But the problem is that the perception that's going out to the Syrian military is that there is an unstoppable rebel force coming down the road, so we just better keep retreating. Whereas in actuality, if even say like a company-sized unit that's well led sets up positions on that road with even a couple of heavy equipment, a couple of tanks or something like that, and maybe some air support, they could probably stop the rebel advance for maybe a few hours, buy some time, or potentially destroy this rebel vanguard in its entirety. But instead, as I keep alluding to, there appears to be very little initiative and freedom of action in the Syrian army because no one's ordering this, and the only order that appears to have gone out is general withdrawal. General withdrawal from Aleppo, general withdrawal to Hama, and now it appears that the orders have gone out to withdraw from Hama itself. What also doesn't help is that the Russians appear to constantly be in retreat as well. The Russians clearly seen early on what the situation was really like, so they withdrew all their troops from Aleppo, and it appears that they're now withdrawing from what remains of Hama and potentially Homs. Probably the Russians are abandoning most of Syria to shore up their positions in Latakia and ride out and see what happens. So there is a very strong rebel force, and it's getting stronger because they're picking up significant amounts of equipment that the Syrians have abandoned along the way. But in terms of like these forces that are just speeding out and capturing here, there, and everywhere, they're actually very small, fairly lightly armored. Like I say, a decent entrenched position by fairly decent quality men could probably stop them, hold them off for a few hours, buy time, solidify some kind of situation. But instead, there is just kind of this self-feeding offensive, self-reinforcing perception that we just have to keep retreating and hope something works out for the best. So from my understanding, that's kind of what we have witnessed over the last 96 hours. And yeah, it's depressing. It really is, because like I say, as someone who was following this war through the 2010s, it was especially depressing to see that the citadel, the famous legendary citadel of Aleppo, which held out for years, literal years, a small group of Syrian soldiers held up in that citadel and were besieged for years in Aleppo, with very little resupply and reinforcement, if at all, held that castle for years until the city was ultimately liberated, and that citadel fell without pretty much a single shot last night. Equally depressing was Kure's airbase, which, again, long-time observers and followers of this war will remember. The legendary defense of Kure's, again, probably mispronouncing it, but that's how I've always pronounced it. This airbase was besieged by ISIS for close to 2 years. They overran the Syrian army positions around the airbase, and Air Force cadets, pilots, and local militia troops held up in the aircraft bunkers, and they held out for 2 years against ISIS, against pretty much everything and anything. For 2 long years, the men held that airbase, and it fell today again without a single shot, with significant amounts of equipment on the base as well. So very depressing for those who followed this conflict. These legendary battles and sacrifices that were made over the years just being completely handed over on a platter to beasts and savages. Of course, Hama and Homs, which look like the next two cities, infamous for the destruction and the brutality of the fighting that occurred there during the high intensity period of the war. So if they fall, just more blackpilling situations as it is. But it appears that in the last few hours is that there was kind of an ultimatum sent by Tehran and Moscow to the Syrians to say, look, you need to put up a fight in Hama, because we're not. If you aren't going to fight for yourselves, we can't come and do the fighting for you, kind of situation. Very mixed messaging about what is occurring in the city. I'll just have a quick look and see if there is any fresh reports. But there were reports that the Syrian army was retreating. There's footage of apparently the Syrian army retreating to the south, but then there were reports that the Syrian army was actually bringing in reinforcements. There's video footage of rebels in the city at the moment, but then there's also footage coming out disproving that, saying that there are Syrian troops in the city. I think this goes back to the sort of nature of the rebel advance, where you have like this convoy of pickup trucks that will ride into a town or a city, take selfies, and then just continue on. Of course, if they're not clearing out the city, there could still be Syrian troops inside the city that have been bypassed. I think that might be what's occurred here. So there's that potentiality. But where's Telegram? Just have a quick look at some sources and see if we have any just have a quick. So forgive me, I'm just having a quick look, see if we have any. So this is coming from a pro-government source. It's saying that essentially there is a mass flight of civilians from the city to the south towards Homs, but that there are Syrian army troops coming into the city from the south, and that there is some fighting going on. That rebels have broken into the north of the city, but there are Syrian army troops in the city who are engaged in combat and are willing to put up a fight. So we'll have to see over the coming hours what if that is accurate. Because if Hama falls in its entirety with pretty much without a fight, you really have to start asking, when will these people ever stand and fight, if ever? Which is quite a thing to say about the Syrian army. Like I say, yes, you have these very poorly led, poorly motivated, poorly equipped conscript troops. But again, this is the army, and there are elements of this army that have been fighting for more than a decade. Some of them very well motivated, some of them very well equipped, some of them, like especially groups like the Tiger Force, which is the kind of the premier unit that people would refer to. But then you've also got elements of the Syrian airborne troops, the Republican Guard and stuff. But this is not quite Afghanistan. Like there are troops here who have demonstrated that they will and have fought before. So it's just kind of a question of where and how they will be able to get into the action. But it is kind of disturbing and depressing to see just what has occurred. Like I say, literal years of blood, toil, misery spent securing, fighting tooth and nail, inch and inch over much of this territory that has just kind of been abandoned over the past few days. So it does appear that there might be some element of fighting in Hama. But if Hama falls without a fight, you just have to ask, well, if they aren't going to fight for the Aleppo, if they aren't going to fight for Hama, where are they going to fight for? Because Hama is kind of where you start to get into the non-Sunni parts of Syria. You have Christian communities down here. This is kind of the gateway to Latakia and Tartarus, which is where you have the predominantly Alawite populations. Very disturbing ramifications if these areas fall into control of these ISIS-light Islamist groups that are currently running rampage. One maybe glimmer of light that I've seen various reports for is that the National Defense Forces, the NDF, these are like the Syrian equivalent of the popular mobilization units. These are the local men who understood that their lives and their community lives were on the line, so they took up arms. These are they're not the Syrian army, they're militia units. Nominally auxiliary, but in many cases they're probably better than Syrian army troops. These are people who are motivated to fight. They're not forced to, well, they kind of are forced in one way, but these are the people who, particularly whenever they come from minority groups, these are the pro-government groups who are like, well, either we fight and we win, or else we and our families and our communities are exterminated kind of motivation here. So a slight glimmer of hope maybe is that I'm seeing lots of reports that there's a major mobilization going on between the Alawite and Christian NDF forces. So whether they're going to be mobilized to go up and try and stabilize the situation around Hama or Homs, or if they're going to stay in their own territories and act as territorial defense, we'll have to wait and see. But the NDF troops, from what I can remember and from what I've seen of the war so far, tended to be fairly good quality, fairly decent, not very well equipped and often not very well led, but certainly motivated troops who often during the darkest periods of the high intensity period of the war, this is whenever you had the Al-Nusra front taking over Christian areas and the like, or ISIS was overrunning much of eastern and central Syria. It was often these NDF troops who stood and fought and held the line whenever the regular Syrian army troops sort of fled. So maybe that's the silver lining, is that maybe there'll be a sort of solidification of resistance to the rebel advance whenever they start to push into these minority held territories. So I kind of alluded to it throughout this. Obviously, I have a side in this that I'm very strongly behind. I'm behind Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government, because their opposition genuinely is like a genocidal Islamist death cult. Of course, I'm sure people who are longtime observers to this war will understand that there's been significant amount of effort to try and sugarcoat and propagandize the Syrian quote-unquote opposition. But as is demonstrated, I think, pretty adequately over the past 4 days, the quote-unquote Syrian opposition is anything but. Very few of them are Syrian. There are reports that there is, in fact, I'll see if I can find it. There is every nationality involved in this murderous gang of this barbarian horde. Apart from the Syrians themselves, there are Chechens, there are Uzbeks, there are Uyghurs from China, there are Turks, there are Syrian Turkmen, there are apparently Pakistanis, there are Gulf state Arabs, there are Western Islamists. There is everyone but the Syrians themselves seemingly represented in this group that is overrunning the country at the moment. So here, I'll just see if I can like, for example, here from Bella Aktum on Telegram, earlier this year, Emir Rustam Aziev, also known as Abdul Hakim al-Shishan, was fighting against the Russian army in Belgorod. So here we go. This is from Belgorod Oblast in Russia. If the video, don't have to download it. So there, and then here is footage of him and his unit operating in Aleppo in recent days. So strange how men can seemingly travel from the war in Ukraine to what's happening in Syria. So that's just one example of what's happened. Like I say, you have pretty much groups of every and any nationality apart from the Syrians themselves who are predating on the people of Syria at the moment. My big concern, of course, is for the Christians and the Alawites. The situation in Aleppo at the moment is, from what I've seen, is that there's a mass exodus of Christians and other various non-Sunni minorities into Sikh Masood, which is the Kurdish enclave. This isn't a part of the city that never fell to government or rebel forces throughout the earlier stage of the war. The Kurds and the Syrian government kind of have this sort of de facto alliance of sorts. It appears that elements of the Syrian army, the local police forces, even some Russian troops, whether they're, again, actual Russian soldiers or Russian military contractors, have ended up in Sikh Masood and Kurdish held areas to bolster the forces there. Christians are currently fleeing much of the city to seek refuge with the Kurds, because it appears that the first night that the rebels entered the city, they entered Christian neighborhoods and began randomly shooting up houses. There's footage of them tearing down Christmas trees through the city. Local churches apparently have been forbidden from opening, this kind of stuff. Just the usual cuddly things that everyone's favorite liberal democratic Syrian opposition is well known to do. So very, very bleak at the moment. And of course, this is also exacerbated by the Eternal Turk, who of course will never cease in their efforts to destroy any elements of Kurdish community, propagating their various proxies in the Syrian National Army to push down from the north and try and cut off this Kurdish government-held land bridge that connects this Kurdish enclave around Aleppo to the rest of Kurdish-held territory. How sustainable that will be in the long run, who knows? There is reports that there have been various clashes between the rebel factions and the Kurds, and the various groups that the Kurds have taken in to defend and seek Massoud, especially today. There's also been some reports, don't know how much they've panned out, that there's been some kind of tentative ceasefire or truce between the Kurds and the rebel groups. But nonetheless, there has been video evidence. I can't show it because it's on YouTube. But there is visual confirmed evidence that there have been fighting between the Kurds and Sikh Massoud and the various rebel groups that have tried to storm the neighborhood today. So it's I've been looking at some tweets of people who live in Aleppo, and it is very depressing. Like genuinely just bleak. The things that these people are saying, the fears that they have, the things that they went through between 2013 up until 2016 and the like, and they're just what they now fear they will be subjected to. So thoughts and prayers definitely with the people of Aleppo, of all persuasions and denominations, and generally with the people of Syria at the moment. Unfortunately, there's been some very dark times throughout this war since 2011, but unfortunately it appears that we will be seeing the darkest because the ramifications of what will happen. I should probably have a quick look and see if I can see if there's any definitive updates before I kind of put my foot in it and say... So I keep seeing footage from pro-government Twitter accounts of various elements of the Syrian army saying that they will stand and fight at various positions, particularly south of Hama. Critical day ahead of us, Aleppo City, NDF Hama guys are in the southern sector of Hama. So the reports that the NDF from Hama, which is I believe that's a Christian majority town, have begun arriving in southern Hama, so that there does look like there will be resistance in Hama itself. But again, I'm not too sure. Let's just have a quick look and see if I can see some updates about this supposed coup in Damascus. So it... Okay, it does look like that or gunfights heard. The situation is now clear. No guns can be... Okay, so thankfully, because that would have been the nightmare scenario, there would have been no coming back from it. But thankfully, it does appear that these reports of a coup... Again, there were reports that a coup had been undertaken by Mahar al-Assad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad, who leads the veteran 4th Division. The 4th Division is kind of this unit that defends the presidency alongside the Republican Guard. It's a good, capable unit. There were reports that it had begun a coup attempt in Damascus. Thankfully, it appears that has not occurred. So thank the Lord that hasn't borne out, because if there was a coup, there would be no coming back from it. What the Syrian government, the Syrian army, would just factionalize into different competing faction, and Syria itself would just dematerialize into perhaps the most archaic bloody fighting since the earliest days of the war. So thankfully that does not seem to have happened. But it should be said that I do think that this has critically damaged the legitimacy of Bashar al-Assad and his government. As I've alluded to throughout, there has been a mostly because of sanctions, especially American sanctions, and then the situation in Lebanon has particularly worsened this. But the Syrian economy is in dire straits. It is desperate. It's never properly recovered. There were some elements of recovery in 2020, 2021, and into 2022. But then whenever particularly Russia got involved in Ukraine, the economic resources it was putting into rebuilding Syria obviously got diverted to other areas. So you do have this particularly bad inflation issue. Getting in goods is particularly bad. Just various elements. The Syrian economy is in a bad way. This has been a persistent source of tension and trouble for Assad's government. So he's secured kind of a tentative peace as sorts for most of Syria from 2020 onwards until this week. But there, if people don't have basic economic needs being felt, it kind of helps buoy up the tension. This has been a big persistent thing that has allowed the sort of tense situation in Dara, where for people who are not aware, Dara is kind of where the Syrian civil war really began. It was the site of the first uprising way back in 2011 against the government. Let me remove the keys. Heavy fighting in the area throughout the 2010s. Ultimately, there was a reconciliation agreement where the rebels laid down their arms. Some of them were kind of given like tentative roles inside like local security apparatus, but they never really properly reconciled themselves to being under Bashar al-Assad. There's usually protests down there, and a lot of it's based on an economic nature, is that the locals can't get jobs. There isn't really any prospects to life kind of thing. And with recent events, it does appear that a new rebellion has begun down in Dara as a result of the collapse of the government in the north. So, you have these underlying these problems for the government that have undermined it over the years. And the one big thing that the government could say is like, look, we've kind of provided you a sense of stability and peace, and that has been pretty much completely undermined and evaporated over the past 4 days. Very depressingly so. So the question is how viable and going forward is the regime, is the government? Can Bashar al-Assad turn this around? Potentially, but I do think like the next 24 hours are the most critical of the entire war. And I say that without any caveat, even going back to the darkest days where ISIS were on the verge of breaking into Damascus. It appeared that, Aleppo was, Aleppo has fallen, but, back in like 2013-14, where it appeared that Aleppo and the entire north was going to fall to al-Nusra, like these really dark days. I do think that we are talking about the next 24 hours are probably the make or break. If the Syrian army does not stand and fight in Hama or near it, when will it fight? Are they just going to retreat down the Homs? And then are they going to retreat from Homs down into Damascus? Like this isn't Afghanistan. The Russians aren't going to be doing an airlift that are going to carry out a lot of these people, all these Syrians to Russia. The Russians would, rightfully so in my mind, leave them to their fate. If they do not fight, people shouldn't fight for them. So if the Syrian army can demonstrate that it can and it will resist, and it should be able to resist, like I say, maybe it needs to call back all the veterans that it sent off into retirement. They need some good officers who are going to tell their men to stand and fight, to dig in and set up defensive positions. But if that fails to materialize, I do, like, what can you do? What can Russia do? What can Moscow do? What can Tehran do? And then ultimately, what can the Christians of Syria do? What can the Alawites of Syria do? If the army and the government proves completely incapable of mounting any kind of resistance, whenever it was effectively had de facto won the war and is now snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Granted, the Turks obviously are particularly, they're the hand and the puppet that has orchestrated this entire thing, but I think even the Turks themselves are astounded by how successful this has gone. Would maybe the Alawites and the Christians maybe just need to start looking to their own defense? Maybe it's now time that the Christians, the Alawites, and the Druze just start thinking about, well, like, if even the Bashar al-Assad has failed us, maybe now it's time for us to just set up our own quasi-statelet and look to our own defense. you know, that was kind of, especially internationally, and that's kind of what appealed to me. If the Syrian government and Bashar al-Assad cannot even defend himself and his own people, and the Christians and the Alawites and the Druze of Syria, then why is he there? You know, that's kind of the big thing. That's the big selling point that I think kind of got a lot of international support behind Bashar. But like I say, just what, granted, it, you know, it is a confluence of factors, but at the same time, I'm just astounded by how bad this has gone. Like, as I say, like, this vanguard of this rebel push down towards Homs is like, Homs and Hama is like 40 pickup trucks. The most heavy equipment they might have is a few mortars, like a couple BMPs and tanks sitting on the main road in an entrenched position with a competent commander could have easily stopped that advance, and if not stabilized the situation, bought some time for things in the rear to get themselves sorted out. So it's very depressing. I'm looking for silver linings here, but hold on, I'm just going to look at some Syrian sources. Syrian and Russian airstrikes going on around the core. What's this? So I'm just looking at some pro Syrian army sources that I'm subscribed to, just having a look at, just to get a sense of. So this is breaking. The commander of the Russian military complement in Syria, Lieutenant General Sergei Kissel, has been sacked from his position. Again, I'm sure there is a lot of criticism that can be said of the Russian element in this, but at the same time, you know, the Russian troops and complement in Syria is mostly of an auxiliary nature at this stage. So I don't really know what this guy could really have done if the Syrian army refuses to fight. I mean, he can't, you know, what can a battalion of Russian military police achieve? So, but unconfirmed reports that the SDF's Deir el-Zor taken over control of the. So another aspect is there's like this wholesale. So as the Syrian army and government pretty much withdraws from much of the country, the Kurds particularly are filling the gap. So like this territory up here was all government held, but as you can see, it's now colored yellow for the Kurds, because there's kind of like a tacit agreement. Like I say, both the Syrian government and the Kurds kind of came to a de facto alliance of sorts over the years. So there's kind of like this handshake and nod that the Syrian army government's kind of doing, like if we flee from a territory, you know, let the Kurds administer it. But now it's reported that the Syrian military have begun abandoning positions in Deir el-Zor, and that the Kurds have started crossing the Euphrates and assuming territorial control of this area. A big concern about the withdrawal of government troops from central Syria is there's the potential for the revival of ISIS in these areas. There are pockets of ISIS still active, mostly in hit-and-run attacks, and a lot of the Syrian army have been engaged in counterinsurgency against these remnants of ISIS over the years. So if they're all pulling out of the area, there is the potentiality for a somewhat modest revival of ISIS. So that is another potential aspect of this. Going into the logistics of why Hama and Homs are so important. Latakia and Tartus, of course, you have the naval base there. This is where the Russian naval and air base are. The naval base at Tartus, and then where's Khamin? The big Russian air base. Whereabouts is it? I feel a bit embarrassed. There it is there. I feel a bit embarrassed because, is that it? Oh, it's Jabal. There's a big major Russian airbase in this area. I believe it's like pronounced Khamin airbase. This is kind of where the Russians have been bringing in a lot of their equipment. Of course, since the war in Ukraine began, because of the Montreux Convention, is Russian naval shipping to Syria has pretty much stopped. But nonetheless, this is kind of this would, if Homs especially fell, it would cut off the rest of Syria from this key stronghold. This is particularly where the Alawites live. The Alawites being the community from which the Assad family comes from. So this is kind of like the demographic stronghold that the government and the Assad government has kind of based itself out of. So that being cut off from the rest of the country would just be extremely bleak. So, and of course, as you can see, nicely reflected on this map, just the roads are indicated here. Key logistics hubs going north, south, east, west, if these cities were to fall. So that's an aspect of why it's so important. But also, like, there's also the sentimental value, as I kind of alluded earlier, like literal years of very brutal fighting was done to take these cities. Granted, ultimately they were ultimately secured by the government via so ultimately, like, what happened through the war is you had entire neighborhoods of Damascus, these places down here. So like you can see them sort of shaded in different colors down here. These were held by various rebel groups. Parts of Damascus and various places in this throughout the country in Homs and Hama were held by various rebel groups. As the Syrian government slowly began to crawl back ground, a lot of these places came under siege, and they were subjected to years-long sieges. And there was like these ad hoc agreements made in various places, often by the aegis of the Russians, where the local rebel groups could get on buses and be bussed up to Idlib, out of the war zone, and allow the territories to be taken and come under Syrian government control, and then they can go up to Idlib and do the various cozy Islamist genocidal things that they like to do up there. So that's what's happened. That's what happened in Homs, in Hama. So you know, a lot of blood, sweat, toil, and tears were spent over the years to take these cities. So Aleppo, especially, like I say, is a gut punch. The second biggest city in Syria. Massive, well, relative to the rest of Syria, very significant economic center now lost to the government, with the resulting economic hit. But also, like I say, the fact that the citadel fell without a single shot fired was very, very blackpilling. Kurdish air base fell without a single shot, very blackpilling. I can't imagine being one of the men who actually sat in the citadel or in Kurdish for years, being shelled day and night by ISIS or al-Nusra, almost starving to death, but yet still being able to put up a fight for 2 years, only to look back today and see them fall without a fight. So very depressing. And then there's also the aspect, like, if say that the government turns things around and the regime becomes resurgent again and the army goes back in the offensive and pushes back up to liberate Aleppo again. It's the fact that Aleppo and a lot of these places had very brutal battles that destroyed much of these cities. So I'm going to indulge a bit of sentimentality here. So we're going to go on to Google Earth and just have a look around parts of Aleppo. So May 2020, is it good enough here? Not the best bit, but I was doing this the other day and it was just so very depressing. It is maybe a bit more into the old city where the fighting was the hardest. Yeah, here you go. So May 2020, this was taken, and this is the rubble and the wreckage of the first phase of the war in Aleppo. As you can see, it's been left there so long, it's been completely overgrown, but Just see all the pop mark of all the bullet holes of the fighting that took place here. And to think that we're probably, that this city is going to potentially be subjected to this again, be it the government comes back in some form to try and liberate the city, or the rebel groups just descend back into internecine fighting. So I mean, it's just very tragic to think about. Like, you just look at the devastation from the little bits of Aleppo that you can see, and you just think about what these people have gone through, and now they're going to have to relive it all again. So here's a bit of an older one, 2018. So where is the ones? So there, like, you can even see part of the wall where there was collapsed during the fighting up here on the citadel. And it's just tragic to think about. Like, here in 2018, but you're thinking about, you look at the people in these streets and what they went through, the horrors that they probably seen, and here they are scrambling, they are salvaging some form of life, some kind of existence out of the rubble of their own city. They, the worst has come to pass, and they're just going to be pushed. So here you go, back in 2017. So this is just after the liberation of the city, and you can see the damage of it. And it's just tragic. Like, obviously this is a very pixelated image, but I just can't help but feel and wonder. Like I say, I was looking at the tweets on of people from Aleppo on Twitter, and just the fears they have, and it's just so depressing to think, like, just look at the state of this. And these are beautiful old city, just hot marked by bullet and artillery fire. And you just think about the people, like, who lived through the worst of the fighting in this city, and now they're going to be pushed back into it, subjected to it again. They have managed, it's just so depressing. It really is. Just, really, it's desperate. It really is. And like I say, as someone who's a bit of a Syrian war artist back around the 2010s, to know the names of these cities and what was done to them, and how brutal the fighting was, and remember following the fighting day in and day out, and see them fall without a fight, and then to know that pretty much, like, worst case scenario, let's say the rebels overthrow the government, HTS and the Islamists continue their unstoppable advance and take Damascus. They'll then inevitably collapse in amongst themselves, because this rebel group is not a single group. It is a coalition of competing Salafist, Wahhabi, Islamist, jihadist groups with all different. They're all united against a common enemy, but that's the only thing that has them unified. I doubt the Turks could really keep the beast of their own making under control, if the beast consumes Syria. So ultimately they'll collapse in amongst themselves and fight amongst each other, and the country, as if it hasn't been destroyed already, would just disintegrate, and the Christians of Syria would become a historical anecdote. And like, especially what Christians in the Middle East have suffered for the past couple decades alone. The Alawites of Syria, the Druze, the Shia, it's I don't want to sound like a diversity is our strength kind of person, but these are historical populations. These are people who have lived there for hundreds, thousands of years. Like, the Christians of Syria were some of the first, like the Assyrians. The only town that speaks Aramaic, the language of Jesus itself, is in Syria. The only population that still speaks Aramaic until this day. And if these Turkish-backed savages get their way, that that bit of not only Christian but just generally world history would be lost forever. The Druze as well, pretty much most of their populations are split between Israel and Syria, and It's just and we're gonna allow this Turkish backed Sunni death cult, which effectively is ISIS light. ISIS is just like the more obnoxious brother of these people. Yeah, they have a bit of a different eschatology and theological outlook, but generally, they are effectively the same people for all intents and purposes. And the other galling thing that it just is just infuriating is you see all these shit libs on social media with the Ukraine flag in their bio, the Taiwanese flag in their bio. They self-profess themselves as like liberal in their bio, and yet they're celebrating this because their entire worldview is, well, this hurts Russia in some form, so therefore the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, the Sunnis themselves, like the Sunni people of Syria, would also suffer extremely horrifically under these people. But genocide is an acceptable cost as long as it hurts Vladimir Putin, because Bashar al-Assad would go. And it's just like, it just shows how little they understand of this, of what, like, I'm not saying I'm the be all and end all. I am an idiot. I am just an autistic person with an autistic interest in geopolitics. So I am not an expert on Syria or what's happened in Syria or the dynamics of intercommunal relations in Syria. But it's just galling to see these like self-professed liberal internationalists cheering on this horrific situation in Syria and celebrating people who, in pretty much any other circumstance, they would condemn as like the most evil people in the world. But because they've bought into this idea that Bashar al-Assad is like the evilest person ever, and because he's a friend of Vladimir Putin, therefore we need to support wholeheartedly anyone who fights against him. And it's like, it's just it just, I'm sure it goes without saying to articulate what my view on such people are. And that also brings me into another aspect. There's a lot of competing ideas about like who has a hand in this. I don't think the Israelis are particularly involved in this. The Israelis aren't best terms with the Turks, and while I do think that certain elements of the rebels have learned lessons from what the Israelis have done in Lebanon, particularly in terms of these communication devices and how exactly that was pulled off, who knows? But I think the Israeli part in this is more indirect, as in like the war with Hezbollah, as opposed to a direct situation. So I actually think the Ukrainians probably have more of a hand in this than the Israelis. I do think that there is an element of Ukrainian organization in cahoots with the Turks to orchestrate this. I guess this is where we'll segue a bit more into the wider Turkish dynamic and stuff of this. Obviously, the Ukrainians are looking to cause trouble for the Russians whenever and wherever they can. There's proof of Ukrainian special forces operating in Sudan against the Wagner group, the Rapid Support for group, which is the pro-Russian faction in Sudan. That's pretty much conclusively confirmed that there were Ukrainian special forces operating in Sudan against Russian assets there. Pretty much confirmed that there were Ukrainian special forces operating in Mali with the Tuareg rebels who orchestrated that big ambush against the Wagner group operations there a few months ago. There's been speculations that there might, again, I'm not anti-Ukrainian. I know this might come across as it. I understand why the Ukrainians are engaging in this kind of behavior and stuff. I'm just trying to outline my personal point of view on this, and from my personal estimation of where we think this is what has occurred. So there's speculation that the Ukrainians have been active in Niger for some of the more Islamist aligned groups who are fighting against the Niger government and the Russian support elements there. It is confirmed earlier this year that the Ukrainians were orchestrated a rebel faction to carry out a drone attack against a Russian, I believe it was S-300 battery, actually at Kurdish airbase. Before I might put my foot any more in my mouth, let me just double check that. All right, Syria. Yeah, so here we go. This is a news article from Pravda, Ukraine. So this is a this is like as pro-Ukrainian article as you can get, pretty much openly confirming that the Ukrainian special forces elements are active in Syria, targeting Russian elements in country in Syria itself. So there, I'm looking for the specific one because I believe there was like hundreds of Ukraine experts training Syria-based extremists in. So here you go. Here's the Cradle. I'm not too sure of this as a source. I'm not too sure if I forgive that. I'm not too sure if what credibility to give this as a source, but nonetheless, I would be surprised if this wasn't occurring. The Ukrainians are training up various rebel groups in Syria, particularly in drone operations. The rebels have been using drones pretty effectively in this recent offensive. Pretty much likely to, almost certainly to, from Ukrainian experts in this. So I'm not trying to paint out that this is all entirely the Ukrainians. I think the mindset here for the Ukrainians is just like, this is where we can cause trouble for Russia. I think that's the idea of the Ukrainian element for it. And as always, you cannot trust Turks. And well, you know, if you're Russian anyway, or I think the Ukrainians have made a very convenient deal with the Turks to support their elements in Syria to undermine the Russians. So I'm not trying to sign this up as like, you know, this is the evil Kiev regime out to destroy the Syrians. I think it is just a very blunt assessment on the Ukrainian point of view of the enemy of my enemy is my potential friend kind of idea. So I think that's the Ukrainian aspect of this. But to go back into the wider element of this, we need to sort of look at the actions of Turkey over the past few years. People who follow me and my content, especially in Telegram, will know I'm often very critical of Russia. A lot of people tend to take it as like I'm anti-Russian or anti-this, you know, in the same vein that people try to paint me as anti-Ukrainian and stuff. Like I'm not. I like Russians. I like Ukrainians. I abhor what they are currently doing to each other. But I do try to take a nuanced take at what they are doing and why they are doing it. So what I think it has happened in Syria recently is kind of an element of weakness on Moscow's part, and I'll try and articulate what I mean by this. We need to go to Armenia and Azerbaijan. Again, I'm not going to go through the entire history of it, but I do think the road to what has occurred in Syria kind of runs through here. So not going through the entire history of it would be a stream in of itself, but I'm sure people who are kind of semi-aware will remember that there's been 2 wars between Azerbaijan and Armenia in recent history, the Karabakh Wars. The most recent one last year kind of resulted in the complete ethnic cleansing of over 100,000 Armenians who have lived in the Karabakh region, which is here. The Armenians call it Arstak. This was an ethnically Armenian region that was assigned to the Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic by Stalin, no less. So whenever the USSR collapsed, Azerbaijan claimed this territory as its own sovereign territory. Armenia sought to defend its own ethnic brothers and sisters in Arstak. This, you're talking about like 1990. Well, before the Soviet Union properly collapsed, there was kind of this ethnic clan fighting between the Azeris and the Armenians. The Soviet Union collapses. You have the first Arstak War. The Armenians pretty handedly win that war. Deal the Azeris a pretty bloody nose. and Arstak is kind of set up as this quasi-independent, ethnically Armenian state, with hopes of one day eventually joining Armenia proper. 1990s, 2000s go through. Armenia is a very mineral. It's not a very rich country. Its demographics are pretty poor. It doesn't have a large growing population. It doesn't have oil. It has mineral resources, but nonetheless, to say Armenia has not been dealt a very good hand throughout history, to put it bluntly. Azerbaijan, however, has substantial oil deposits. They use these oil deposits to fund a pretty extensive build-up of its military through the 2000s and such. Both of these countries are also nominally closely aligned with Russia through this period. They both join. Do they both join the CST? I believe they do. They definitely are both members of the Commonwealth of Independent States. But actually, I don't think Azerbaijan ever formally joined the CSTO. Let's have a quick look. Okay, they did for a very brief period, but they left in the 1990s. But nonetheless, Moscow historically has always held a significant amount of influence in the Caucasus. And it sought to maintain that post the collapse of the USSR. This led to things like the situation with South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia, the 2008 Georgian War, stuff like that. The way the Russians sought to preserve a form of influence in Armenia was deploying of peacekeepers to Arstak, bringing Armenia into close military alignment with Moscow through the CSTO and the like. In terms of Azerbaijan, it was weapons sales. There was kind of this logic in Moscow that if we sell significant weapons to both sides, that preserves our influence in the country, because obviously we are their supply line for their weaponry and the like. The technicians, the support to maintain their weaponry and stuff relies on us. The supply of ammunition and parts have to go through us, so therefore their military capability kind of relies on us, so that we have influence over them. The problem is that was true for Armenia, a very poor country with, like, look at the geography of Armenia. It's got Georgia to the north, not too hostile, but then again, not the most friendly relations. Outright hostile relations with Azerbaijan, because you have the Arstak issue. And then to its west, we have the common villain to all this story is Turkey. I'm sure I don't need to go into why the Armenians and the Turks don't particularly have a very good relations with each other, to put it bluntly. So to the south, you have Iran, which, here or there, not especially close, not especially hostile. So Armenia looks to its historical guarantor in Moscow to preserve its independence and sovereignty and economic and military ties. So Armenia is kind of forced by circumstance into becoming a closely aligned power with Moscow. Azerbaijan, because of the wealth that it finds, has more options. The Azeris are an ethnically Turkic people, ethnically very closely related to the Turks. I believe often the term is that the Turks refer to the Azeris as just like the Mountain Turks kind of thing. Very closely aligned Turkic ethnic ties between both of them. So whenever Azerbaijan became independent from the USSR, the Turkish state began seeking close alignment with Azerbaijan. As Turkey rises in power through the 1990s and 2000s, 2010s economically, builds up its military, it becomes an increasingly large supplier of arms to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan cultivates close relationships with Israel and with the United States and Western powers. So Azerbaijan has the ability to divest its military reliance on Moscow builds itself up economically, militarily, to the stage where it effectively just completely outcompetes Armenia and defeats Armenia into the two Arstak wars in 2020 and 2022, 2023, which led to the ethnic cleansing of the historical Armenian population that has lived there for thousands of years. The Turks were heavily involved in this. It's alleged that the Turks threatened the Armenians that they would shoot down Armenian aircraft, provided direct military supplies to the Azeris, cut off all exports and imports into Armenia through their common land border. Going back to Syria, various Turkish-aligned rebel groups that are active in Syria turned up in Azerbaijan conveniently to fight for the Azeris against the Armenians, and stuff like that. So the Turks have had designs on the Caucasus, and it's come into, this is a very historical feature. Many of the Russian-Ottoman wars were over the same thing. But Turkey's a rising power. Russia is kind of in the region, the power in relative decline. The problem that kind of comes in here, which leads it back into Syria, is that because Armenia was in this alliance with Moscow, this direct military alliance, CSTO, with Moscow, in many ways, Moscow was obligated to come to the defense of Armenia, which they didn't do. And this has pissed off the Armenians, and it's now leading to Armenia effectively kind of drifting rapidly out of Moscow's sphere and orbit. Moscow, especially in the Second Karabakh War, this is kind of how the Azeris were able to get away with it. The war in Ukraine had started by this point, so even if Moscow was willing to intervene, it really couldn't, because it was tied down in Ukraine. So in effect, Moscow just kind of saved face by using every diplomatic excuse it could in the book to try and wave off its obligations to Armenia. But nonetheless, this sent out a very strong message that if you're an ally of Moscow, if you're closely aligned to the Russians and you expect the Russians to come to your defense, while they are heavily engaged in Ukraine, don't expect them to do it. So this sort of very quick meander for the Armenian Azeri issue. How this feeds back into what's happened in Syria is, I think this is what's happened is, this is another one of Putin's great ideas, where in 2020 we'll sign this kind of cessation of direct conflict agreement with Turkey in Syria, and then we'll go off, deal with Ukraine and stuff like this. But the message in Ankara was set. Pardon me. Apologies, my throat is starting to give out. But forgive me, I need to take a quick drink. So the message that was sent out by the Karabakh Wars was that now, if you've got designs against a Russian ally, now's the time to enact them while it is engaged in Ukraine. So that's what I think has happened here in Syria. Is Ankara has seen that the Russians have gotten it themselves in a bit too deep in Ukraine, and if they're going to attempt anything in Syria, now is the time to do it, and they have done it. And like I say, if there wasn't the conflict in Ukraine and this kind of stuff happened, this is the kind of situation where you would have the VDV would be rapidly deployed in to stabilize the situation, kind of thing. Obviously, that's not accomplishable at this moment. So that's kind of the geopolitical situation I think is culminated in this. Israel seriously degrades Hezbollah, and kind of hobbles Iran. Russia becomes significantly engrossed in events in Ukraine and is unable to fully commit to Syria. The Turks sense their moment of opportunity, and they take it, and this is what we are seeing at the moment. So that's kind of my cobbled together estimation and view of what we are seeing and why we have seen what has happened in Syria. So just to give my throat a little bit of break, I'll just have a quick look to see what the latest. So the Iraqi Prime Minister says that his country's commitment to Syria's stability. Rebels enter the city of. So there you go. That's these Turkish monkeys are still advancing into the Kurdish held territories. Rebels in the center of Hama. So that's what they're saying. Let's have a quick look and see what the. Let's have a little look see and see if I can. Fighting with terrorists in it. So this is a Syrian military source that I'm following. Fighting with terrorists in Idlib is not just fighting with groups, it is fighting with an army with large numbers of IGMA, saying I'm with them tanks. I'm not too sure what those are. Must be a bit of a dodgy translation there. Tanks, armored vehicles, da 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 da. Seed, so situation is bad. Put it bluntly. It does, however, look like there is this some form of the solidification of resistance, that the Syrian army in places are finally starting to come together in a coordinated fashion. And it does look like there is going to be a fight for Hama. Some reports that the rebels have withdrawn from the city, which is kind of what I was like. This is what I've been saying kind of throughout the stream, is that if there was just a unit, a well-equipped unit with competent commander who is willing to stand his ground, set up a defensive position, and just backhand slap that rebel convoy coming down the main road, is they would fuck off back up the road. Like hours down the line, of course, a heavier rebel force, probably with tanks and heavy weapons, would come down the road. But do you know what I mean? It would buy time. It would show that there is some resistance somewhere, and that you've bought some time for the men behind you to get their act together and start to entrench. And that's what seems to have happened at the moment. But with the caveat, there are conflicting reports absolutely everywhere across this thing. But it does appear that there's been some kind of pushback in Hama, and that the rebels have potentially withdrawn from the city. So if that's true, what we'll probably see is in the hours, probably tomorrow, the main rebel force will start to coalesce to the north of the city, and we'll start to see a bit more of a pitched battle for the city. So, but the main thing is that the advance has been stopped, and that the Syrian army has a bit of breathing room to get its act together, start to bring, just get everyone back under its control, stop the retreat, and start to establish defensible positions. Because that was the big thing. Like, once the rout began, it just wouldn't stop. And the big problem is trying to get it to stop. First, you had the communications completely cut out because of the various shenanigans going on there. But then whenever they resumed, whenever they came to a new position where they were going to establish a defensive line, rebels had bypassed them. Well, quote unquote bypassed, 5 pickup trucks with rebels in it drove to the town down the road ahead of you, took some selfies and drove on. But as far as you know, you're just getting reports that that town was falling to the rebels. So instead of establishing your defensive position, you're like, well, we need to retreat more. So like, fingers crossed, it does appear that has stopped. Fingers crossed. So Syrian government deployed the paratroopers of the 25th Division to Hama, north of Hama, to launch a counter-offensive against HTS. Syrian regime stands its ground in Hama, so it looks like we are tentatively back. It looks like we are tentatively back. So, pardon me. There are reports that the rebel faction down here, this bizarre enclave, This is actually occupied by US troops. There is an American military base here. For years, there's like, this is where the Free Syrian Army, last enclave of those scumbags, are based out of, propped up purely by the Americans. If the Americans weren't there, that would long ago have been liberated by the government. But anytime the rebels or the Russians tried to go in and liberate this territory, the Americans would come in and airstrike them. There are reports that these scumbags have started to go on the offensive. Wherever Washington has its hands, well, ultimately these people are Washington's proxies, but nonetheless, there are reports that these people have become active and are going on the offensive. So at the moment, like I say, the situation is pretty dire. But if they do stand and fight in Hama, then things can start to, that's whenever the clawback begins. A big issue of concern for me is the situation in the south of Syria. If these areas are rising back up in rebellion, it could just be a drain on a drain on resources. The military and the Damascus government can no longer cannot divide its forces between. So. Right. New Rybar report. An armed uprising has begun in Dara province. It's worth noting that among the rebels are military personnel in Syrian army uniforms. This once again proves that the 5th Volunteer Corps project turned out to be unviable. Unfortunately, Russian military advisors failed to perfect the otherwise ingenious project of General Alexeyev. The Syrians themselves refused to recognize the reconciled as fully fledged members of society, and the Russian administrative resources were clearly not enough. So there you go. Rybar is pointing out another Russian innovation in Syria that is completely fell on its face. I kind of mentioned it, I believe, at one point in this stream, is that some of these rebel groups in the south that were quote unquote reconciled, some of them were integrated into like quasi police units. So it appears that those groups have potentially gone back into rebellion. The other question is say if the Russians and the Iranians come to the rescue, are they really just going to fight all this all over again and save the Assad government and then just kind of walk around and say, okay, we've done it again, away back and let yourself carry on as before? If the government does survive, and Colonel General Alexander Chayko has led Russian troops in Syria during the first dawn of Idlib, second Idlib offensives, successfully pushed back gains. So looks like the Russians have appointed a Syria veteran. So okay, like while I've been on stream, it does appear that there has been a bit of a improvement in the news that's come out. So I am seeing more reports that the Syrian army is preparing to attack the Kurds. There you go. Footage of, like, see what I mean? Just Albanian militant in Aleppo. So as I was previously mentioning, it's like every nation but the Syrians themselves are involved in this. And of course, how did they all get here? Is they all came from Turkey and they're all armed by the Turks. So there report that the Islamic State has gone on the offensive in Homs Desert. But that's like I say, with the caveat, news changes very fast, but it does appear that there's been there has been a bit of a stabilization in progress at the moment. That the Syrian army has finally found the will to fight and are starting to. See, the tragic thing is, it's like, best case scenario, the Syrian army stands and fights, it regains the initiative and starts to claw back. The problem is, it's like it's clawing back to fight territory that had been hard won years before, and there's been so much equipment that had been lost that's been, abandoned. That means the fight back is going to be so much harder, which is just the added tragedy to the thing. But I think we're Assad bros. I was very, very pessimistic at the start of the stream. Very pessimistic, but Assad bros, I think we are tentatively back. I think we are tentatively back. So forgive me, I'm just gonna let this song play. Brothers' morale is slowly rising, and I need to drink and give my throat a quick rest while I scan for new news. Michael, you are too emotional. Like, seriously. Like, I'm invested in this. Like, I've the one faction of this wants, like, the complete genocide of everyone who isn't Sunni. Like, I'm sorry. Like, to me, there is an undoubtable better option in this conflict. They've fucked up the past few days pretty epically, but they are far more preferable to the option that's behead everyone who isn't a Sunni. So just go through bunker housing for 20 Swedish krona. Truly dark times indeed they are, but hopefully it looks like we're starting to get a bit of a glimmer. And then bunker housing for 50 Swedish krona. Spoke to my Serbian friend. He thinks the Turks are playing with fire. What is your in the chat's assessment? Well, I think the Turks are in a position of strength here, but because what can Moscow really do at the moment? And the West isn't going to do anything. The West has pretty much sold out the Kurds to Erdogan long ago. So my hope, my optimistic assessment is if the army sorts itself out and there is a resurgence and they slowly start to claw back and turn this thing around, is that instead of stopping like they did in 2020, they keep going up into Idlib and they push these savages. They kill them to a man, or they push them back across the border into Turkey, and that's the Turks deal with the monsters of their own creation. So could this be a proxy for Erdogan to take out the Kurds? It is. That's it's mostly directed against the government, but you can bet that ultimately the Turkish ambition here is to undermine the Kurds. Very much so. That's what they're, because that's effectively what all Turkish policy here in Syria is about. It's about undermining the Kurds. And that is from Gerald Armstrong for $5 US. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, guys, for doing super chats. I know this is the first stream I've done in a while, in a long time, but I just felt the situation demanded it. The events in Syria have just been horrific, to say the least. So as someone who had a long time interest in it, you know, like I say, I do feel a bit invested in what's going on there. Like I say, I just feel horrific for the people of Syria at the moment, and the Christians and the people of Aleppo. The churches of the Valley of the Christians, so you're talking about down this here area. So the local Christian communities down in this area along the border of Lebanon, there are reports that they have opened their doors and their communities to the people fleeing from Aleppo. So Charlemagne for £10, I appreciate your coverage. Thank you so much, I appreciate it. And SD guy 3030 for $2 US. Sad bro, we're kind of back. Yeah, we're kinda. It's been a very hit and miss, and there's still a lot to go, but you know, I'm not going to say it's optimistic, but it's the news is a bit rosier than what we were looking at just a couple hours ago. So Syrian channels are reporting the rebels have taken control of several weapons manufacturing plants near the city of Al-Safira in Aleppo Governorate. With these factories were used for the production and storage of chemical weapons that the Assad regime had previously used, yada yada yada. So it's just news flying thick and thin. There's some reports alleging that the YPG, which while these are all Kurdish areas, there are different factions amongst the Kurds. You have the Syrian Democratic Forces here more towards the west, and then you have your sort of YPG, the more sort of Iraqi-ish kind of Kurds here in the east. There are reports that they are apparently mobilizing to potentially try and do an offensive against the government. Hope not. I hope the Kurds will be smarter than that. I hope Kurds realize that they have a bigger enemy, common enemy with the Damascus government, and it's to the north, it's not to the west or the south. So another aspect that it's been going on is that Bashar al-Assad has been in Moscow conveniently throughout this situation. Just to put it into a bit of context, a lot of people have been reporting that he fled the country and that his various family have fled the country to the UAE and stuff. That's not true as far as I can see. Bashar went to Moscow before the rebel offensive began. It was a previously planned bilateral visit to Moscow that just happened to unfortunately coincide with the offensive. So that's a bit of news to clarify on. And he returned to Damascus from Moscow on a Russian Air Force aircraft within the past few hours. So Bashar is back in Damascus. I guess we will. Forgot I had that playing. I hope that wasn't too obnoxious. Have that play. So pardon me. Other news is that the Iranian foreign minister is flying into Damascus tomorrow to meet with Bashar, and then he'll be flying on to Ankara after that to have a meeting with the Turks. So I hope he very much understands that you cannot make deals with Turks. They cannot be trusted. I really do think we kind of missed a trick with that coup against Erdogan back in 2016. So let's have Turkish journalist reporting in Turkey. I don't think that is a viable source there on what's happening. So just to have a quick look. This is footage reported to be of Syrian soldiers congregating in Hama. So it does look like we're starting to get the visual evidence of Syrian army slowly coming together to bring things together. So more footage from central Hama, which shows Syrian army vehicles. Looks like some BMPs. I think maybe a couple of tanks there. It looks like T-72. So does look like the army is starting to coalesce in Hama. So as I articulated earlier, what I think happened in Hama earlier on is I think, like I say, these rebel advances, mostly the lead elements of it are convoys of pickup trucks with people who will get out of the truck whenever they go into a new town, take some identifiable selfies of the location, get back in the pickups and drive down the road. So I think that's what happened. I think the Syrian army was probably still in a bit of chaos. Some of them are probably still in the process of retreat out of Hama. Some units are probably spread out in other parts of the city. I think these rebels probably drove into the city, took some footage, put it out on social media, and then probably started to drive out of the south of the city and ran into some Syrian army units that probably destroyed them or forced them to retreat. And then the army went back into the city and has established control there. So that's kind of what I think has happened there. This is why I think we're also getting these reports of there's still Syrian soldiers active in Aleppo, because the situation on the ground is so fluid. These rebel groups aren't establishing complete control over these territories. So you'll have various cut off police units, Syrian army forces that are kind of cut off behind the lines, behind the rebel positions, which maybe potentially could cause some trouble for the rebels, start hitting them in the rear and stuff as things slowly start to come together and people understand where they are, what they can do, and what is available to them. So modest charity for $13.99, I believe that is Canadian dollars. Thank you so much. Let's celebrate their first super on a live stream. Thank you so much. I think that's going to be like a sticker. And then new mail soybean for $5 US. You are clueless. Thank you very much. Erdogan is a puppet. Okay. I mean, thank you for the donation, but I am on this platform, so I don't think I can really engage very much with that comment, but thank you nonetheless. So more reports that the NDF forces have mobilized in Christian territories in Latakia and are going to Hama. So it does look like Hama is going to be the focus of the pushback. So the next 24 hours, like I say, will be crucial if this resistance actually mobilizes into both allaying the rebel advance, not only allaying it, but actually repulsing it and going back onto the counteroffensive and clawing back territory. However, like I say, they're developing situations across the country, down in the south, these reports that the Kurds might be starting to get ambitions in the east. What's going to be happening over here in southern Aleppo governorate? Like there's a lot of territory that's going to have to be covered. So, but at the same time, it should be said, like from my estimation, it appears that the rebel groups out of Idlib might have like about 30 to 40,000 troops, men in total of it. Can 30 to 40,000 men really hold down all this territory that they're hoping to take? Especially if the Syrian army gets its act together and starts to call back the veterans into its ranks, really starts to get the Russian and the Syrian Air Force back on the gear of doing effective airstrikes. The NDF mobilizes back up to full strength. Like you're talking a few 100,000 men that could be mobilized back into the Syrian army. And, like I say, in that scenario, ideally, they would then begin this slow, long push to just evict these people completely from the national territory completely. So Syrian army mechanized have recaptured the northern part of Hama city from rebel forces. They are seen at the Al-Sahbani roundabout. So are we going to be talking about that area there, I'm assuming? Okay, it looks like there's quite a few little roundabouts. Okay, there you go. So this area where there was, let's have a look at the source. Revolutionaries are now Al-Sahbani roundabout. Okay, not really much go with there, but where there was reported to be rebels earlier on, that now we have visual footage of the Syrian army now in control of that. So having recaptured Jabal Zain al-Abidin. So there you go. It looks like the Syrian army is now starting to push back to the north of the city. So optimistically, if they really start to push back up the road, they could probably make back a significant amount of territory, because the main fort, like I say, up until this point, the vast majority of the rebel advance in this to the south have been these very fast, lightly armed pickup convoys. So the main force of rebel troops will probably take a while to get down the road. So the Syrian army could probably either decide to dig in and establish defensive positions to weather the storm whenever it comes, or maybe push back up, reclaim territory, and meet the main force of the rebel army coming down the road. I'm too Syria brained at the moment, but I have just seen the news about Nick Fuentes and Destiny, so like I'm focusing on one thing at the moment, and that is not it. So let's have a. So what about you guys? Has anyone in chat seen any interesting news, any questions people want to fire at me? Because I think I'm probably going to wrap this up a bit. I think I've kind of articulated, once I log off the stream, I know there'll be other stuff that I was meaning to say, but I think I've kind of articulated the main points of what I was hoping to get through. Just got my scatterbrain meandering thoughts out there. Could you also let me know what was the audio like? Because I keep playing about, I don't like, I for people who are on the YouTube, I have been doing somewhat regular video game streams over on Rumble. Just because I feel a bit more freedom of action, and I've kind of been testing things out, but do let me know what the audio is like. Has it been decent enough for you? Because I keep playing about with it, but I never like it whenever I listen back to it. All is not lost. Arms, power, the flesh. Will you do more streams? I would like to. I would like to. I've been meaning to. Uh, a tentative yes. However, I would prefer potentially to do more streams on Rumble, because the main reason I kind of just gave up on YouTube was the strikes they gave me for talking about Wagner. Just kind of really frustrated me and lost. I just feel I'm able to be a bit more open on Rumble. So any chance Iran will invade, not invade, but there is a potentiality for an Iranian expeditionary force to be deployed. So it's always darkest before dawn. That's the way I'd say look at this. So the next 24 hours, that's kind of just repeating myself at this stage, but the next little low, but it's good. You need to do more streams. Okay, sorry. It's probably just I need to speak closer to the mic or play about with the decibels on it. So I am kind of just repeating myself, so I'm going to start to wind this down. But yeah, the next 24 hours I think are probably the most crucial. This is make or break time. If the army can demonstrate that it can and it will fight, there is chances to turn this around. If they all just completely collapse again and go back on the route, then I think it's pretty much over. So that's kind of where we are. It will be interesting to see what, if anything, the Russians can potentially spare to send to Syria. I guess there's a very, very basic cost gain analysis to be made in Moscow. Any units they spare from the front in Ukraine will mean less territory gained there, and to stabilize Syria. And also, they are kind of running against the clock in Ukraine. So obviously January 20th, whenever Donald Trump takes office, is whenever we're expecting things to really break one way or the other there. But I'm kind of expecting, so like another scenario I could see is if Bashar can hold out till mid to late 2025, I'm expecting there'll be some kind of agreement in Ukraine that stops the high intensity period of the war there, which, the Russian war economy flowing as it is, the amount of men who've been flooded into the Russian military, the amount of contracts signed, I think that if Syria can last long enough for a tentative agreement of sorts in Ukraine to come into play, then I think it'll open up a significant amount of resources for the Russians to send to Syria, which I'll probably go into this another time, but I also think that would potentially be a very good thing for Russia to slowly wind down the war mobilization on its end. So, when will Turkey be stopped? Probably never, because they've been doing it since they first came out of the they've been at it since they first scrambled out of the steppe. So, HTS units of the Kurdish have launched an attack on the Kurdish neighborhood of Sheikh Maksud in Aleppo. It should also be said that so what's happened down here in Halbasia. As reported here, is apparently there's been a local uprising by pro-rebel civilians in the town. As you can see, this is on the main road between Hama and Homs, so that could be a bit of a potential worry, depending how armed and how sustainable that is, and if the army and the government can't quickly quash that. So, yeah. So, is there any final stuff you guys want to throw at me before I start to wrap this up? Thank you very much for coming along. I know it's been one of my sort of usual ad hoc streams, but like I say, the situation just kind of demanded it because of what's been happening. Also, yeah, it's just absolutely astounding how like you go on X and you start looking at especially the anti-Assad, like pro-Islamist rebel tweets, and the amount of like, especially the Muslims, the people with the big beards wearing the Islamic hats and stuff, and their profile DPs, like Doctor, what's this guy's fucking name? Omar Suleiman. And you look at where he is with his hot take about like how freedom and liberties coming to save Syria from fucking the evil Bashar regime. Location Dallas, Texas. Let's have another look at this. This guy, location London, of course he's in London. Just why do we allow these people in our fucking countries? So, thanks for the information. That was a very good stream. Well, like I say, I know I tend to meander and spurg out a lot of stuff, but I do try my best. Hey there, how do we support you? I guess a super chat or something. Don't feel obligated to. But thank you very much for the thoughts nonetheless. For those of you who are not aware, I don't know how you wouldn't be. I am on Telegram. That's where I do most of this work. Hopefully it's showing up on screen right now. At Delabrock. If somehow you really don't know what I do, I aggregate news from various sources. I've particularly been focusing mostly on events in Ukraine and Russia. But as Syria kind of shows, I do tend to meander off into other interesting geopolitical issues as they come about, and just kind of my own little autistic take on my interests in politics and culture and stuff that I spurg out. So I'll post a quick link in the chat now. I don't think no, I haven't put them in the bio. So link to the Telegram's going up in chat now. And if you're very keen, although I use it mostly the ship post, I am also on X here as well. This hasn't been like one of my best streams, so I'm not going to post the donation and stuff links, but if you're very keen, I'm sure you can find them. So pro-S Syrian army outlet says large number of auxiliary troops have arrived in Hama. So that would be the NDF forces. That's probably the Christians and the Alawites starting to arrive in mass. So link to Rumble. Yeah, I should probably start shilling the Rumble a bit more. So the Rumble so far it's more just my ship posty gaming streams. I'm posting the link now to the Rumble. Like I say, if I start to get properly back into streaming, I'll start to look into doing my proper geopolitical war streams over on Rumble, because I do feel a better sense of look. I do feel a greater sense of freedom to talk about various issues over there than I do here. So have you ever played Stallcraft? I assume you mean StarCraft. No, I haven't. I've never been a StarCraft player. So, um, like just a. I mean, this is a kind of a. This is something I can, I guess, show on stream because I can't really show you the beheading videos, the execution of prisoners that are going on. But like, here you go. The Islamic Emirate of Idlib takes Aleppo, and naturally, their first port of call is to start tearing down the Christmas trees. You know, just to, you know, obviously it's a very weak thing that I can show at the moment, but you know, if this is kind of the mentality of people who've just taken over a city, it doesn't really bode well for the people who celebrate Christmas who might still be stuck inside that city. So, President Bashar al-Assad is now holding important meetings with the leaders of the military and security institutions in Damascus. So it sounds like, I'm to figure it's probably pretty late in Syria now. You're probably approaching midnight. So it does look like the president it does look like based Bashar is back. And yeah, scrolling through Telegram, and I'm starting to see videos apparently of Nick Fuentes sucking Destiny's cock. Okay, so with that exciting update just off the bat there, I think I'm probably going to call this a night. So very much so, Syria is going to be my big attention at the moment. I am keeping a cursory glance on things that are happening in Russia and Ukraine at the moment, but obviously unless something very big, you can't say Mossad the Assad on YouTube. Well, I just did, so we'll just see. You cannot Mossad the Assad. So check him YouTube. If not, I'll just go to Rumble. So I'm going to be keeping very much. Syria is going to be occupying my attention till we start to see a stabilization of this thing. I'm keeping a bit of a eye on events in Russia and Ukraine, but they're, you know, it's just a general story. The Russians are gaining ground in Donbass. Fighting continues in Kursk. There isn't like any big, you know, developments. Obviously, things that are happening in Syria at the moment are quite spectacular. So that's going to be the focus for me in the days ahead on the Telegram, keeping a close eye on this, seeing how things go. I am keeping a cursory glance on things in Russia and Ukraine, but very much so we're going to be sort of transitioning. Probably a bit of a palate cleanser to some of the more longer time viewers who might get a bit burned out on Russia and Ukraine. Maybe Syria will be a bit of a nice change of pace for a bit. So that's very much going to be my focus over the next couple of days, few days, until we start to see a stabilization of sorts that comes out in Syria. So thank you very much for people who've joined us for this stream. Like I say, this is kind of how I do the streams. A bit more. I did actually have a structure for this, but events were changing so fast. It kind of just evolved into one of my meandering streams. But it is what it is. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope it kind of gave, as best as my understanding, a bit of an idea of what's occurring, why it's occurring, who's involved, who's benefiting, who's not. So if you did kind of get something out of this, like I say, come join us in the Telegram. I do try to be a bit more lighthearted and a bit like the Telegram's the Telegram. It's kind of where I ship post, but also try and do a bit of analysis here and there. Links are in the chat above. Also on Twitter, and go check out the Rumble. So thanks very much for coming. And depending on what developments we have over the next few days, I might do another stream on Syria. Failing that, I should be doing another Left 4 Dead stream with Giza and Count Dankula on Monday, as kind of is tradition, but that would be on Rumble. So keep an eye out, and I will hear from you guys again soon. And thank you very much for coming, and hope to hear from you guys soon as well. Take care.